traps and what was in the vicinity and surrounding of these devices. So this is simultaneous and indiscriminate violations to international humanitarian law.
Figures seen by LBC show hundreds of vulnerable children are being held in unsuitable and illegal accommodation. Holiday lets and caravans are being used because of a national shortage of secure care placements. LBC's Charlotte Lynch has the details.
This happens because of a court order which is supposed to protect and support the children. But families we've spoken to say it's doing the opposite, with the young people deteriorating after being isolated hundreds of miles away from home. Former Children's Commissioner Anne Longfield says they're then put anywhere social workers can find for them.
Hotel bedrooms, even caravans, their ability to have any semblance of a normal life is just out the window.
1,200 children were subjected to this in 1 year, with the hearings held behind closed doors. And it's rocketed by 500% since 2020. The government says it is committed to creating more proper places for them.
A row has broken out this evening over Nigel Farage's claim he can't hold surgeries in his constituency due to safety concerns. LBC understands the Speaker's office has no recollection of issuing the advice. The scientific director for the Titan submersible has testified that it had malfunctioned just days before its fatal dive. A US Coast Guard panel is investigating the implosion last year, which left 5 people dead. And interest rates have been held at 5% after inflation remained unchanged last month. Economists believe the Bank of England will bring the base rate down in November. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 75 points at 83.28. The pound buys $1.32 and €1.19. LBC weather largely cloudy tonight with a chance of drizzle in the northeast, clear and dry for the northwest and a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
3 minutes past 9 on LBC. We are streaming this hour live on Global Play. If you'd like to watch us, you can see this wonderful party shirt I've got on. It's only, Simon, because the next 2 weeks I'm hardly going to be at home because of the party conferences. And I counted up the shirts that I've got, and I thought, well, I'll wear one today that I wouldn't normally wear.
I thought it was to celebrate my return to the studio. I'm bereft now.
Well, I'll tell you, I've been looking at the schedule on LBC over the past few weeks, and apart from when standing in for me, you've been standing in for virtually everyone else as well. When are you going back?
Well, I have to travel elsewhere for the next week.
Right.
I'm heading off to New Delhi and then Dubai, all the garden spots, to do a little bit of business. And then I will be back here briefly next weekend, and then I'll be back in the US. So I'll be back. So the short answer to your question is I will be raring to go from October the 1st onwards for the last, just over a month of this election campaign.
And I realise I haven't actually introduced you yet. This is Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent. And we are going to indulge in another session of question marks. Or is it question marks? I never know how to,
I think you can go with either.
Articulate it. And he's going to be answering your questions on anything to do with US politics, particularly the presidential election. Now, I was trying to remember when we last did this. It was sometime, I think, in early July.
Yeah, I think a couple of months ago.
Quite a lot of water has gone under
Absolutely.
the electoral bridge since then. Just take us through maybe the highlights or some lowlights of the last few weeks.
Well, I don't think we've done one since the party conventions, have we?
Haven't.
And so shortly after the last one, I headed off to Milwaukee, where, of course, the Republicans held their convention and were in utterly ebullient mood, completely convinced that Donald Trump was going to win the election in a landslide over Joe Biden, and exuding, I think, more confidence than I had seen from a political party of either stripe about the outcome of an American presidential election for a very long time. Of course, the smile was wiped off their faces 48 hours after they left Milwaukee as Nancy Pelosi's cabal against President Joe Biden succeeded conceded, tacitly supported by former President Barack Obama. And Joe Biden...
Cowardly supported, I would say.
You cowardly supported, certainly tacitly supported, certainly supported. There's no question about that. And, of course, Joe Biden did what he had to do, which was fall on his sword in the face of Nancy Pelosi threatening she said, we've been doing this the easy way for the last 3 weeks to try and get you out. Now we're going to do it the hard way. So Biden was gone. Suddenly the party coalesced around Kamala Harris. Could not, I think, genuinely believe the character, talent, energy and ability that she demonstrated in those very early days.
She hasn't done that for the last 3 years,
This was not
she?
the Kamala Harris that the nation had ever seen previously. And remember, I think it's important to remember this, Ian, on the day that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, his approval rating was at a low point of 38.5%. Her approval rating was 38.6%. So she was effectively just as unpopular as the president she served. And it is important to note that even now, her approval rating is still underwater. I think it's 47% roughly of the country disapproves of the job she's doing. 45% approves of it. And that is a problem because after all of these weeks, including the extraordinary spectacle of the Democratic Party convention with those searing speeches from Barack Obama, from Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton made a very strong speech at that convention, and I have not heard many of those from her over the years. And then, of course, the speech that Kamala Harris made, which was fine. She did well. They were hoping for a massive bounce in the opinion polls. This was Kamala Harris essentially having to introduce herself to the country because, as you say, they'd seen and heard so little from her over the past 3 years. She has undoubtedly erased the deficit in the opinion polls that Joe Biden had against Donald Trump, but she's not in the convincing lead that Democrats want to see in order to think that this election is safe.
But has she been given an easy ride by the American so-called liberal media? Because I would suggest that she has.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, with the caveat that there has been the harping and the criticism over her failure to grant the doyens of that liberal media interviews. But yes, I mean, the interview that she did grant to Dana Bash of CNN, the One Network interview she's done, was not particularly prosecutorial.
No, and that wasn't even on her own, was it?
She had Tim Walz beside her. That's true. There's some precedent for that. I mean, that's been done before. But there were very few follow-ups. I mean, for example, how do you do an interview with the Vice President of the United States, who has just become the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, and not really push and probe what she knew about the state of President Biden and when did she know it? There was very little of that in that interview, and also very little of holding her feet to the fire over the policy pronouncements that she is making, which are very limited in scope. I'll give you another example. The debate with Donald Trump, where the moderators from ABC sought to fact-check the debate to the best of their ability in real time. They fact-checked Donald Trump absolutely reasonably when he made entirely misleading statements about the situation in Springfield, Ohio, and people eating their pets. They fact-checked him when he claimed that Tim Walz believes in executing some babies after birth. I mean, the most bizarre fact check in the history of the United States. A moderator reminding the audience that in no state in America is it legal to kill babies. But they didn't fact-check Kamala Harris when she said that as president, she's going to give $50,000 and $6,000 tax breaks to people to start small businesses. Well, she's not going to do that because she's very, very, very unlikely to have a Congress that is ever going to back that.
But you can't fact-check that.
You can at least challenge the assertion. You can challenge the assertion. I would say that
was for Donald Trump to challenge rather than the moderator.
He can't challenge. His microphone's switched off.
Well, he could in his next answer.
Okay.
I'm just trying to nitpick, aren't I, really? Right, Brian in Scotland on a WhatsApp message says, Simon, does Donald Trump ever say that his mother was Scottish and he has links back to Scotland? We don't hear too much of his conversations other than what the mainline press report.
He does actually, Brian. He talks a lot about Ayrshire, of course, because he's got the golf club there. And he speaks, he used to speak very often about his admiration of the Queen, which he tied to being the son of a Scottish mother. So he does talk about, Donald Trump, as we all know, mostly talks about Donald Trump. And he certainly doesn't often talk in particularly personal terms about his family. He has, on occasion, spoken about the pride that he has in his children. Obviously, there are questions about the precise nature of Donald Trump's marriage to Melania. However, he did issue a love note to her on Valentine's Day, and she has certainly spoken very tenderly of him since the attempted assassination in July in Pennsylvania. But he has certainly spoken about his admiration for Scotland, rooted in his own personal experience as being the son of a Scottish mother.
Now, Donald Trump had never met Kamala Harris until the 9/11 commemoration.
No,
sorry, until the debate.
Yeah.
And then the next day.
That very strange thing, yeah.
And she apparently called him after this second assassination attempt, and he said they had a very nice conversation.
Well, the interesting thing about all of that is if you watch that debate, when they first come onto the stage, they're sort of like prize fighters eyeing each other up, and it's not immediately clear that they're actually going to come together. And then, like magnets, they are sort of slowly drawn together.
Well, she walked over to him.
Yes, and she reaches out her hand and she introduces herself. She says, Kamala Harris? And he shakes her hand and says, have a good time, right? The next day, at that 9/11 commemoration, her attention is drawn to his presence by the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who basically pulls her across. And she shakes his hand, and he says to her something to the effect of, you did very well last night. I mean, he actually paid some tribute to her performance, said, well done last night. And then there was the phone call after the second. It's not really accurate to describe it as an attempted assassination, but certainly there was an assassination plot. What interests me about all of these interactions is that there are circumstances in which the relationship between the two of them becomes for him a matter of freedom or imprisonment. Because if he loses this election, and if the federal criminal cases go ahead against him, and if he's found guilty in either of those cases, one over the attempt to subvert the outcome of the election, the other over his alleged mishandling of classified documents, she, as president, will have the power to pardon him of those federal cases. She can't do anything about the Stormy Daniels case because that's New York and she has no power. She would have no power over that. But she could literally be the person who decides whether Donald Trump goes to jail or is pardoned. And it's interesting that they have established some sort of communication, albeit communication that to some extent was unavoidable.
Right, another WhatsApp message here. If you'd like to put a question to Simon on the phone, 0345 6060 973. It's from Cheryl, who says, why can't people pronounce Kamala Harris's name correctly? It is baffling to me. Her nieces went on TV and pronounced it for everyone, and yet I constantly hear many wrong pronunciations for what should be a simple pronunciation. Well, if you just say it as it's written down, it's Kamala.
Yes.
There was a time when we were told it was Kamala, but it is actually Kamala.
Yes. I will say that Iain Dale was ahead of the curve on this particular issue, because it was Iain who first pointed out to me many, many months ago, probably years ago, on air, I'm bound to say, that I might be mispronouncing the name of, I think she wasn't even the vice president at that time. I think she was still the vice presidential nominee. So we had all been led to believe that it was Kamala. Or Kamala.
Yeah.
But I guess we're now going with a slightly softer O. Of course, Donald Trump has deliberately been brutalizing her name on the campaign trail, and at various points has called her Kamabla for reasons that nobody can fully understand, and now just refers to her as Comrade Kamala. But I think we've settled on a solution, haven't we? But you were ahead of the game.
Well, thank you.
I don't remember how you found that out.
I don't remember. No, I remember. Well, I know recently the BBC newsreader, Tina Dahaley, I think I probably pronounced her name wrong there, she did a little YouTube video of it because clearly she'd got rather vexed at people because I kept saying dare I say it, one or two of our newsreaders here had been pronounced, and I kept sort of screaming through the class, tell them it's Kamala. And I think she had felt the same thing. And I then tweeted this out, and then people said, no, that's wrong. And you think, well, if Kamala Harris herself says it that way, then surely that's what we should think.
Well,
is
I
the
think
right
you go
way to
with
do
the way
it.
that the kids did it at the convention. I think that's the solution.
Right, we will come to your calls in just a moment.
You could just, and of course, what she hopes is that you'll end up just calling her Madam President.
Well, indeed, and I mean, I don't think it's any secret that that's what I hope will happen. Obviously, you have to maintain strict neutrality on this. But anyway, right, more of your WhatsApp messages, your texts, and indeed we'll come to your calls to Simon on the US presidential election in just a moment. It's 16 minutes past 9.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
18 minutes past 9. Richard in Texas wants me to say the name of the previous Democratic president before Joe Biden, which I'm very happy to do, Richard. It's Barack Obama. Is that correct, Simon?
Is there some doubt over that?
Well, I don't know.
Barack Obama.
Maybe in Texas they say it differently, because they say most things differently in Texas, don't they? How would you say
He didn't. Barack Obama.
Because he sort of says more like Barack.
Right.
We're disappearing down a rabbit hole.
I'm really
here.
glad we're having this.
Yes. Let's move to the calls very swiftly before we get taken off air. Michael is in Rains Park. Hello, Michael.
Good evening there, Ian. Great to hear you back on the radio, and good evening, Simon. My question regarding the US presidential race is whether Simon thinks that there's been too much focus placed on the characters in this presidential race. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of drama with Biden stepping out of the race and Harris taking on the Democrat nomination. But my overall thought is that there's been some discussion about Trump's tariff policy. Harris has tried to make abortion a big issue, and she's discussed some issues around housing. But overall, the media don't seem to have focused on the wider culture war that's taking place in America. Because when you ask a lot of Trump supporters why they're supporting Trump, it's not necessarily because of their the inspiration that they find in Trump as a leader or a person. It's because of their stance in the culture war.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I largely agree with what you're suggesting. I mean, the reality is that American presidential races are always covered like a horse race, and there is always far too much focus on personality and far too little focus on policy. But this year, there is barely any focus on policy. And that is what is so astounding, given the stakes in this presidential race. I mean, we always say every 4 years, this is going to be the most important election of our lifetime. This time round, that's actually true. And the fact of the matter is that let's talk about what's been going on in the last 10 days, right? The media in America has been absolutely hijacked by Donald Trump saying at that debate, they're eating the pets, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs in Springfield, Ohio, speaking of illegal immigrants. Well, it turns out that they're not illegal immigrants. They weren't eating the cats. They weren't eating the dogs. They weren't eating the pets. But this has become the only issue that has been covered in very large measure on American television, in the newspapers, on the radio over the last 10 days. Now, there are really important policy discussions that should be had. And, policy proposals, as I was suggesting earlier, Kamala Harris's economic policy proposal should be held up to the light. And it's not happening. I mean, equally, you talk about Donald Trump, attracting support because of his stance in the culture wars. I did an interview many months ago with the president of the National Religious Broadcasters Association in America, trying to understand why evangelicals go for Trump, because it was right in the middle of the Stormy Daniels trial, and you couldn't imagine that they found common cause with Donald Trump's conduct as it was revealed during that trial. And his answer to me was, no, you don't understand. We back him because he does what he says he's going to do. We've lived through so many Republican presidential candidates who have made promises to us on issues like abortion, but not only abortion, and then have not delivered. Donald Trump told us what he was going to do, and he actually delivered. And that's why his support in that constituency is largely solidified. But I do think that we are lost in the United States now in terms of being able to witness a presidential election in which the focus is on policy. And I don't think that is Donald Trump's fault entirely. I think he plays a role in it. I think it is a media that has allowed itself simply to be distracted on a continuing basis. And, the 24-hour news cycle fuels this as well. The social media cycle fuels this as well. Distracted by the latest outrage, the latest viral moment. And it eclipses all serious conversation about these crucial policy issues that ultimately lie at the heart of the election, including that tariffs issue that you were referring to.
Isn't it even worse than that? And this has been the case, I think, for decades. It's nothing new. That by and large, political reporters for the major networks and indeed in the written press in the United States would generally support a Democratic candidate. And because Donald Trump is seen as anathema, seen to be an extremist, therefore they don't put Kamala Harris under the same scrutiny that they put a Republican candidate under. And because there's this little thing in their brain that's saying, well, we really want her to win. Now, I mean, I'm very open in that I want her to win, but I'm running an opinionated radio show. I'm not doing news reporting. I'm not sort of reporting from the White House. But I think that does colour a lot of reporting, but you see it all the time.
Well, I think it colours some reporting. I think it's important to understand that there is a very powerful pro-Republican, right-wing journalistic juggernaut out there in the form not just of Fox News, but Newsmax, One America News. There's a whole variety. Conservative talk radio in the United States is still a very, very powerful and lucrative behemoth, lucrative for its owners. So it's not the whole of the media that is giving Kamala Harris a free ride, but there is also no question that there are pockets of the media where, if you look at MSNBC, for example, which is as left-leaning as Fox News is right-leaning, and frankly, as propagandizing as Fox News is propagandizing, there is very, very little filter that is attached to their coverage, for example, of the Kamala Harris campaign. And I think that is problematic. And feeds into a situation in which we just don't have very many substantive conversations anymore about policy. And the policy details, as our caller suggested, Donald Trump's tariffs proposal, he's talking about 200% tariffs to keep certainly Chinese electric vehicles out of the country, but all sorts of other goods as well. That should be the meat and potatoes of an election conversation. So should her plans for the economy, bare bones though they are. What are her differences? She says she's going to have a different policy towards the Middle East. She's not going to be silent about what's taken place in Gaza. What does that mean? I mean, you need to prosecutorially be inquisitive about all of this stuff, and we're not seeing very much of it.
She is taking a leaf out of the Keir Starmer playbook, isn't she?
Absolutely.
Because, Keir Starmer wangs on about reform, doesn't actually say what it means. It just all sounds rather nice.
Well, I think with Kamala Harris, and I've said this several times already on my American Week slot, she's got the sizzle bit down. There's no question about that. She doesn't yet, I think, have the steak part of the dish down. And it may well be that she is gambling on the fact that she doesn't need to put that out there, that the sizzle alone might drag her across the finishing line.
So she's got the sizzle, but not the sausage.
You could say that, as you did.
I did. Graham in Bushy has an interesting one. He says, if there is another assassination attempt on Trump and it's successful, who would be the Republican candidate? Would it be J.D. Vance and note the pronunciation, Vance, not Vance, as people on the BBC keep saying? Or will it go back to the members to choose again? Well, as I understand it, postal voting starts tomorrow.
Yes, postal voting, I think in 5 states gets underway tomorrow. It's obviously a tenth of the country, and certainly we're going to see rolling deadlines for these early voting procedures to get underway in various other states. If Donald Trump were to be assassinated, there is a procedure that would allow the Republican Party to reconvene the convention delegates. I mean, you don't just because you're the vice presidential nominee doesn't automatically mean you become the presidential nominee.
Oh, doesn't it?
No. I mean, clearly J.D. Vance would assume that he was going to do that, but there would have to be a procedure for that to occur, and that would occur by reconvening the convention delegates virtually. They wouldn't pull them together in person. And the states would have to get behind him, and they'd want that because you'd want to have some sort of fillip of, pushing him and endorsing him. Would he face any kind of challenger? I mean, at this stage of the game, or whatever stage of the game that might occur, I think would be very, very complicated. But there is a process that would allow it to happen. But as Iain rightly observes, in many cases, these ballot papers are already printed.
There comes a point in the process where you couldn't take Trump's name off the ballot because
he'd be on the ballot.
But it would then be printed.
But once Vance was officially sort of endorsed by the party, those votes would, I think, hew to him. I mean, the Democrats, of course, would find themselves in a position where they could legally challenge some of that stuff if they wanted to. It would get very complicated and very messy.
It almost seems a bit awful to contemplate these things, but say that happened, or say Donald Trump died of natural causes 5 days before the election. Is there any mechanism for postponing the election?
I don't think there's a real mechanism for you can always do anything, but there's no obvious constitutional mechanism for postponing it.
Right. This is from RJD, who says, how does the voting system work in the US, and is it anything like first past the post?
It's much too early in the election campaign, RJD, for me to explain the Electoral College. I don't do that until 2 weeks before Election Day, normally. The important thing to remember is this is not one election. There are 50 individual elections because each state and each territory runs its own election. And so there's no commonality to rules. Every state has different deadlines, different days on which early voting begins, different regulations for how the vote count occurs. But broadly speaking, in each state, it is largely first past the post in the sense that if you win that state, you gain in most states, all of its members of the Electoral College, which of course then meets to certify the outcome of the vote. And remember, you need 270 delegates in the Electoral College to win. That's a plurality, a majority of votes in the Electoral College. But, as I say, each state has its own rules and it's supremely complicated to understand, which is why, of course, Donald Trump made efforts after he lost in 2020, more than 60 of them in courtrooms all over the country, to appeal the outcome of elections and to say this election was rigged in Georgia, it was rigged in Pennsylvania. Didn't get anywhere at all. And I think that in the event of a close election result this time around, let's say Kamala Harris wins in the Electoral College but doesn't win the popular vote. So he gets more votes than her, but she wins in the Electoral College. What we saw in 2020 will be completely dwarfed by the efforts that Donald Trump engages in to try and overturn the outcome of the election and to appeal it legally.
Right, more questions to Simon on the US presidential election in just a moment. It's 9:31 on LBC. Daryl Jackson has the news headlines.
The Foreign Secretary has called for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah after coordinated explosions of the group's communication devices. David Lammy's been speaking after meeting his French, American and Italian counterparts for talks in Paris this evening. The head of Ofsted says it's simply not good enough that vulnerable children are being contained in illegal settings because of a lack of care places. LBC's learned hundreds are being placed in holiday lettings or caravans. And the Titan submersible's scientific director has told an inquiry that the sub malfunctioned just days before its fatal dive. Dr. Stephen Ross says passengers were tumbling around. 5 people died when it imploded near the Titanic wreck. LBC weather largely cloudy tonight with a chance of drizzle in the northeast, clear and dry for the northwest and a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
9:34 on LBC. Simon Marks is here answering your questions on the US presidential election. Maname is in Barnet. Very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Hi, yes. Hi, folks. As a Londoner, a 20-year-old Londoner, Kamala supporter who does not have a vote in this election, I'm just baffled as to how, given all the indictments against Trump and January 6th and all that, American voters who support him don't see that, and that doesn't count against him. And given the media cycle, is it the misinformation? Do people believe the misinformation? Because what I got from the debate was Trump had to rely on misinformation quite a bit. You know, the eating the dogs, eating the cats type of stuff. why are Trump supporters believing that? How is it? It just baffles me.
Well, you're not alone in that, if it's any consolation, because I remember watching that debate live in bed, and I just thought, if I was a swing voter watching this, there was no way that I would even consider voting for Donald Trump. And I really wasn't looking at it through rose-tinted spectacles. I just thought, well, it's impossible to understand how anyone could think he won this debate. And then, of course, I look at Twitter, and all sorts of American political commentators were saying, yes, a clear win for Donald Trump. And I'm thinking, am I living in a parallel universe?
Well, I think you were experiencing a parallel universe because you were seeing these sort of instant polls that got taken by some of the right-leaning media. I mean, with absolutely no scientific basis whatsoever, that showed that 93% of the country thought Donald Trump had won it. Well, it was 93% of their audience that thought Donald Trump had won it. I think, Maname, there are a couple of things going on here. I mean, first of all, it's just hugely important to remember America is absolutely polarized. It is a 50-50 country. And if you look in detail at some of the polling data, just some of the polling data that came out this week and within the last couple of weeks, more Americans believe that Donald Trump would represent real change than Kamala Harris. And if you are a believer,
that's reasonable to think.
And if you think this is a change election, then that would suggest that favours Donald Trump. Equally, more Americans believe that they will be better off personally, financially, if Donald Trump becomes president than if Kamala Harris becomes president. And in a country in which that key question is always, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, that plays in his favour. Now, as far as, the slew of criminal indictments, convictions in the case of the Stormy Daniels case that he faces, he has argued, as you know, that the Department of Justice has been weaponized politically against him. And he argues that Joe Biden is entirely behind all of these criminal cases. I mean, Joe Biden was clearly not behind the Stormy Daniels indictment in New York. There is no truth in many of the claims that Donald Trump articulates. But he has persuaded many of his supporters that there is a two-tier justice system at work, even though, of course, Joe Biden's own son has had enormous difficulties with the criminal justice system. And he's persuaded his supporters that the Department of Justice has been weaponized, which is why, if he wins election in November, he is vowing to strip the Department of Justice of its traditional, not constitutionally guaranteed independence, and has also spoken about taking his own reprisals legally against his opponents and people that he says have wronged him. But I definitely think that, while it is very easy to write off his supporters as deluded and misguided, there is a rich seam of support that he taps into, as I was saying, from, for example, the evangelical Christian community, that overlook all of the nonsense because they are convinced that he, as president, is going to deliver on the issues that they care about, furthering abortion restrictions in the United States, appointing federal judges that are going to do that, appointing school board figures that will push back against what the Republicans argue is woke curricula in various parts of the country. All of those social issues, they believe that even if you hold your nose while you go into the voting booth because you don't admire him personally, all of those issues they believe Donald Trump is going to help them out with if he wins another 4 years.
I mean, can you? I just think it's weird because I've spoken to folks who are Christian and who are Catholic and who are against abortion, and what they say, and many of them believe, as Kamala Harris says, that you don't have to abandon your faith or your deeply held beliefs to agree the government should not be telling a woman what to do.
Absolutely. But that is a conversation that is not happening in a febrile environment, in a tribal environment, which is where the United States is politically now. All of this, by the way, is completely confounding to Democrats who cannot believe that this race is basically deadlocked, who fervently hoped that by now Kamala Harris would have eked out a 10, 12-point advantage over Donald Trump and the race would be over and everybody would be declaring it a landslide. They cannot believe that this race is anything other than a landslide for Kamala Harris. And, maybe we'll all wake up on November the 6th and it will be a landslide. And we'll say to ourselves once again, why did we ever read the polls? Why did we believe what they were saying? But if we don't wake up in that reality, there is absolute evidence in some of these opinion polls that there are voters out there that are drawn to him, partly because they think he's going to deliver on issues that they care about, and also because they actually think he's going to be better for their wallets and their bank accounts and their retirement accounts than Kamala Harris.
Thank you very much, Maname, for your call. Let's go to another one. It's Robert in Leytonstone. Hi, Robert.
Good evening. What a treat. We've got the two of you. What a treat.
Reunited, and it feels so good,
the
Robert.
The gruesome twosome.
Well, let's hope my question doesn't split the two of you. Relating to the UK economy, and I feel that when the Conservatives were in power and Donald Trump was in power in the US, that relationship in terms of coming to economic trade solutions between the two of us went considerably better than gone like, even with Labour and the Democrats in the US. It just doesn't seem that we've actually progressed anywhere. And I was wondering that with Donald Trump in, perhaps if we're lucky and do get a switch of government from Labour to someone else, or even with Labour, what chance do you think there is of improving the economic trade arrangements between the two of us?
I assume, Robert, you're asking about the possibility of a US-UK free trade deal?
Well, not necessarily with the US-UK as the whole of the US. I'm thinking of the individual states, because that went quite well. I believe we set up some good arrangements with them. So it's more to do on a state-by-state basis. And that's because I think the UK-US really difficult with things like this chicken and all the other things going on, that of coming to an open deal between the two of us covering all trade. But individual states, I think we can do deals with.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question. Look, I mean, on the broader prospects for a US-UK free trade deal, and I think Mr. Dale and I have disagreed about this in the past.
Have we?
We have, I think. Not for a while, though. I think they're dead in the water.
On?
I think you thought there was a chance that we might see a US-UK free trade.
Not under a Democrat president.
No. When Trump was in, you thought that there could be progress on it. I think the US-UK free trade deal is
I don't think there will be this
absolutely
time,
dead in the water. Right? I mean, because and it's dead in the water because if there's one thing that unites Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it's their love of protectionist policies. Joe Biden is all about boosting American jobs, and he's not engaging in any free trade deals with anybody anywhere. And Donald Trump also is all about boosting American jobs and protecting the economy. The other point to make about the free trade deal is it's not really in the purview of the president ultimately to decide all of this, because free trade deals are considered treaties and they have to be ratified by Congress. And there is no chance of getting a free trade deal through Congress anytime soon, because then you find yourself having every single bit of it being rewritten by members of Congress from farming areas and members of Congress from industrial areas, and the labour unions want to weigh in. It's just not going to happen. You are absolutely right, Robert, that individual trade agreements were struck and have continued to be struck with individual states. And that process can continue regardless of who's in power in the White House, because then you're not dealing with the presidency at all. You're dealing with the governors of each of those individual states. And certainly Tim Walz, for example, has been, as governor of Minnesota, Kamala Harris's running mate, has been quite active in terms of forging free trade agreements between Minnesota and other countries, not the UK, but certainly, there would be the possibility for that kind of conversation based on what he's done with other nations. So it's going to have to be a low-level, state-by-state thing, and that's obviously time-consuming and doesn't give you the sort of the blanket coverage of a national deal. But I think a national deal is totally off the table.
Robert, thank you very much for that. This is from Deborah, who says, I cannot believe that you, Simon, the ultimate Trump supporter, is speaking on LBC again.
It's amazing they let me back, Deborah.
Deborah, would you ring in and tell us how you come to the conclusion that Simon Marks is the ultimate Trump supporter? Someone else says here, if your listeners want to know how the USA elections work, I suggest they watch The West Wing. Now, I think that's actually good advice.
It's very good advice. I think so, yes. Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's responsible from a civics perspective, and also it's quite fun.
But it's 113 episodes.
Yes.
So, I mean, I actually rewatched the whole of The West Wing earlier this year again, and it hasn't really aged.
No, it absolutely holds up. I think that's not a bad bit of advice.
And the other one to watch, if you want to binge watch an American political TV series, is Madam Secretary.
Oh, I'm glad you said. I thought
for
a minute you were going to say House of Cards, which I
did
not
like
at all.
No, didn't like
in the same boat.
No.
The original House of Cards, the original House of Cards, the British House of Cards, fabulous.
Yeah.
The other thing I gave up. I got frustrated.
Me too.
Because you know why I got frustrated? Because I was living it every day. And then to come home and watch it at night, I just thought, I can't do this.
And every single character in that was a horrible person.
Yes, no one with whom you could empathise at all. Absolutely.
Right. We'll take some more questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 9:46.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
9:48. Simon Marks is here answering your questions, and we have one from Clive in Miami. Hello, Clive.
Hi, Ian. If Trump were to narrowly lose the election, what do you think could be the worst case scenario in terms of how his supporters could react and how that could impact the stability of the country?
Well, I think Clive, it is a massive question, isn't it, Clive, as you will know, being right there in the Sunshine State. The worst outcome, I think, for the country and possibly for the rest of the world is a narrow Kamala Harris victory that Donald Trump then decides to protest against. Because the situation this time around, given the amount of time that Republicans have spent putting officials in positions of authority in many of these key battleground states, getting lawyered up, in some places changing regulations so they might have more luck pursuing criminal, investigative cases into alleged voter election integrity, I think has the potential to become a nightmare scenario. Now, the question as to how much power and influence does Donald Trump have over his Make America Great Again supporters to foment on a national scale the kind of uprising that Washington, D.C. witnessed on January the 6th, 2021, is unknowable and unproven. I mean, you could argue that actually many of his supporters are experiencing a bit of Donald Trump fatigue, that the old routine is beginning to wear thin. I think that when it comes to get out the vote operations in the November election, you're probably going to find more enthusiasm on the part of Democrats to show up at the polls for Kamala Harris, certainly way more enthusiasm than many of them had about showing up for Joe Biden. And perhaps it's going to be hard for Donald Trump to generate that level of excitement among Republican supporters. But I think we will be wandering down a very, very dark path if you end up with another contested election. And that is likely if Kamala Harris wins it narrowly. A Kamala Harris landslide, a convincing win in the popular vote and in the Electoral College would make it much harder for Donald Trump to advance those kind of arguments. But there's no indication that we're going to witness a landslide both in the popular vote and the Electoral College. And so I think there are very nervous, 47 days out now, very nervous days and weeks ahead as we wait to see what happens on the evening of November the 5th.
OK, Clive, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, Nigel Farage was sitting in that very chair this morning, Simon, and Nick Ferrari challenged him on Trump's claims about migrants eating cats and dogs.
Whenever he says something like this that sounds absolutely crackers, in the end, there always proves to be some truth in it.
You think Haitian immigrants are eating cats and dogs?
I'll have a tenner with you. That within the next month or so, we find some evidence of it. What the scale of it is, I've no idea.
But you do think some cats and dogs are being eaten in Springfield, Ohio?
I think Trump generally, when he says these things, is proved to be right.
I mean, the reality here is that even J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, has now conceded that this was invention.
Oh, I thought he doubled down on it.
He's defended it as invention. He's defended it as invention by saying at least it's raised the issue of the invasion of migrants in Springfield, Ohio. And we're going to be talking about this, by the way, tomorrow on American Week, 10 to 6 on Tom Swarbrick's programme tomorrow evening in detail. What Donald Trump wants to do by injecting that into the television debate is to focus the country's attention on the immigration issue, and
which he
has totally successfully done. And the truth or lack thereof of this claim that Haitian migrants are eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, is really background noise. Now, the notion that when Donald Trump says crackers things, they always turn out to be true is demonstrably untrue. I mean, all of Donald Trump's claims about the 2020 election being rigged against him have turned out not to be true, as more than 60 courts across the land determined. So there is no evidence to suggest, after every political journalist in the land has descended on Springfield, Ohio, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that this initial story was true. Indeed, the woman who first put it on social media has now pulled it down and says she never intended to kick up this kind of a fuss. She had no idea what she was posting. Donald Trump himself, faced with a fact checker at the debate who said, well, we spoke to the city manager of Springfield, Ohio, and he said this didn't happen. Donald Trump's own response to that was, well, I saw it on television, as though that inherently makes it true.
But I heard it on LBC, so it must be true.
There is no evidence at all to suggest it's true. But honestly, the veracity of it is not the point politically. The point politically is that Donald Trump wants to make immigration and the genuine crisis on America's southern border, for which Kamala Harris has culpability.
Now, here's an interesting one.
An issue.
Another one from Richard in Texas.
Yes.
Not querying pronunciation this time. Simon, do you think the half a million Haitians, yeah, in Florida, well, Richard might take exception, in Florida will now vote Democrat?
That's a very interesting question. I hadn't thought about that.
Because that could be, in some states...
It could have an impact. Yeah. Absolutely could have an impact. I mean, that's a very interesting question as to what the legal community which has the vote might do as a result of this. I mean, certainly what has happened in Springfield, Ohio over the last couple of weeks. I mean, you've seen the schools having to move to virtual classes because there have been threatened attacks all over the city. It's been a very, very ugly episode. Whether it has an impact on those voters or not, I think is something worth keeping an eye on.
Keith says, my favourite American political drama was Designated Survivor.
That was pretty good.
That was good.
Right.
Kiefer Sutherland.
That's not bad.
But the Korean version is much better.
Is it?
Have you seen it?
No.
Try and watch it. It's absolutely fantastic.
Dare I ask?
What?
Well, where do you find it and how did you find it?
It was on Netflix, I think.
Oh.
They have a lot of Korean drama, which I sort of kind of got
into. Did you watch
into.
it before the American one?
No, I watched it after. Oh. But it's a similar plot line, but a bit more complicated. But I mean, the trouble is you have to read subtitles all the time.
Oh.
But it's rather good.
Unless you speak Korean.
Yeah, which I don't. I don't even speak French. So Shane says, my name is Tonka. No, it's not. It's Shane. He says, I'm from Sydenham. My view is everyone seems to have a problem with Trump, but he stands up for what is right for his country. And I think England needs someone like Trump. Go Trump.
Okay.
Point of view.
It's a viewpoint.
Yeah. Somebody else says, Trump had a packed-out rally of 16,000 people in New York last night, and tickets were sold out within hours. Why does Simon think Trump is doing a rally in such a blue state?
Oh, well, no, that's a really good question. Who's asking that question?
S.Y. But he hasn't finished, though.
Oh, sorry.
Or she hasn't finished. Does he really think that he can win it? Could it be that he's betting on the big Jewish vote in New York, 20% of New York, if my memory is correct, not going to Kamala? Does he have a real chance of winning in New York?
Well,
the answer is no.
The answer is no. I don't think he does have a real chance of winning in New York, but I think it's a very interesting question because if you go to places in New York like Long Island, not that far outside Manhattan, suburban Long Island, you will find rich communities of support for Donald Trump. And that has been developing over the past few years to a point where some have suggested that eventually there might be competition in New York. And remember that Democrats in New York have really suffered from scandal. If you look at what's taking place to Mayor Eric Adams and the investigations into his administration in Manhattan, the New York Times this week published this graphic of all of these people associated with Mayor Eric Adams, a Democrat who runs things in Manhattan, all of whom are now being investigated in an alleged corruption scandal. There is definitely a taint that is beginning to be attached to Democrats in not just the Big Apple itself, but New York State more broadly. And I think that Donald Trump wants to demonstrate that he can infer that New York might be in play. Even if it isn't really in play, it demonstrates a strength more nationally that he feels confident enough that he can go to New York and hold a rally like that. But definitely those towns and villages and hamlets of Long Island are a very, very rich source of support for him.
Simon, professional that you are, you finished 18 seconds before the end of the hour, which is unusual for you.
Unbelievable. I normally just go about, I normally eat into Ben Kentish's programme. Oh, here he is.
Alex says, tell Ian I love him. Well, I love you too, Alex, but then I love all my listeners.
Nothing for me?
Nothing for you, no. Maybe next time. We are going to ramp up our US election coverage, so we will be doing this again with Simon, I would imagine probably the second week in October.
I might even be in America then.
Yeah, well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Make a pleasant change. Well, thanks for all your calls and messages this evening. I'll be back with you on Monday evening from 7, live from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, assuming they let me in. Coming up at 1 on LBC, it's Clive Ball, but right now, I haven't seen him for 2 months. It's Ben Kentish.
You look the same here, but definitely a bit thinner.
A lot thinner, thank you very much.
We'll go with a lot thinner. Good to see you in the flesh.
You don't,
good to
by
have
the
you
way.
Back. I don't at all. Hello, good evening. Coming up.
We don't have to use taxpayer money on additional security, and that's why I've taken the decision that I have. I think